I'd now like to invite Dr. Andrew Foss, a Vedic astrology scholar who has come all the way from Virginia, United States of America, to address us. Over to you, sir.
I was also born in Kenya. Distinguished Dharmadhikari ji, Honorable Justice, distinguished saints and scholars, speakers, and our wonderful audience. So I'm trained as a scientist. I've worked as a scientist. I studied physics at Oxford University, and I have my master's and PhD from Canada in computing science, publications in Nature and other journals and conference proceedings. So some people will ask, what is a scientist doing studying Vedic astrology or Jyotish? Well, firstly, science tells us that we should not pass an opinion about something until we've studied it. So that's something which even scientists forget sometimes. My experience with Jyotish is that the commonly understood Jyotish we find in the marketplace, it works sometimes. But if you study it in depth, you have a good guru and all that, it can become amazingly accurate. So that's why I've taken to research in this field. Now, those who can predict very fine details about things, they generally have a well-developed intuition. I met a Jyotishi here in Karnataka once, and he told me that he expected his students to do pranayama for 10 years before he would teach them any Jyotish. So this concept of it being a spiritual discipline, of requiring a spiritual discipline, is very important. In fact, even in Vishnu Purana it makes it very clear. It's essential. The Western materialistic model of university training, on which modern government policy everywhere is based, is generally afraid of anything that touches on consciousness. Hence, for example, even in India, there could be a course on Ayurveda which does not teach any Nadi Vigyan, the pulse diagnosis, because that's really a matter of consciousness. It requires a very calm and deep state of mind. We should be very clear that this materialistic approach is founded in the 19th century mentality of what we call a classical worldview. Now, what was it that caused this? 19th century physics basically had the idea that infinity was inaccessible. We would never experience it. And this firmly held belief led to a complete split between the intellectual world and the world of, say, religion and faith. Now, at the end of the 19th century, the physicists realized they got it wrong. They did some calculations, it didn't work anymore, and they were forced to develop a new theory, which we call quantum theory. Now, quantum theory opened up the potential for understanding consciousness and bringing the whole field of faith and, say, yoga and all this into the field of intellectual understanding. But the problem was that even though the scientists knew it was a good theory and it worked very well, they didn't understand it. Why? Because their brains were still functioning with the old materialistic view. Those who'd had some deep spiritual experiences like Einstein, they knew that's where the truth lay. But for 100 years we've had quantum theory, but no proper understanding of consciousness, which means that even today, our universities, our whole system really is based on the 19th century worldview. Now, it's just so happening that around about now, for the first time, the knowledge is just beginning to develop about how quantum phenomena can be found in organic materials, in the brain. And this is going to completely change everything, but it'll take some time to filter through, obviously. So when I talk tomorrow, I'll explain a little bit about this. Now, in Vedic astrology, we have a very objective view. Basically, like in all the Vedic science, we can see everything in terms of sattva, rajas, and tamas. Sattva, put very simply, is something very positive and helpful. Rajas is just normal activity. And tamas is where all the cruelty, carelessness, and ignorance is found. And these are tendencies which are present in all of us. It's just that the balance is different. So in the Janma Kundali, you can see the relative balance of the sattva, rajas, and tamas. And some people, they have too much tamas perhaps, and that causes some disturbance. So it is the responsibility of the leaders of society to somehow control tamas and ensure that it doesn't cause disturbance of the peace. And for us who have taken an interest in these things and represent to some extent religion, spirituality, and various related professions like Ayurveda and Jyotish, we have to try to maintain the high standards of sattva which the founders of these disciplines and faiths dictated in the beginning. Now, for people who have some understanding of both science and what I could call the yogic field, we need to try to explain. I mean, that's why we're having this event today. We have to try and explain to the population and the leadership why consciousness should not be ignored in education and in the field of governance. Now, I'll tell you one very interesting thing about science from a scientific. I want to mention a little bit from the physics point of view, a little bit from the Jyotish point of view. Now, there was a great Indian physicist called Satyendra Nath Bose, and he was thinking about the quantum theory, and he realized something very important. And there's two kinds of particles in nature. There's what we call fermions, which are responsible for difference. That's why I'm not falling through the floor. And then there are bosons, named after Mr. Bose, that are responsible for harmony, for harmonizing things. Now, it turns out that even the fermions, like electrons, they can get together with each other and start functioning like bosons. So they also can turn into some kind of harmony. So what happens is, suppose you have a piece of metal and you cool it down. Cool it down means relax. Even the word relaxation is used in physics. So there's some kind of process of calming down, just like in meditation, which eventually reaches a ground state. Now, in the classical physics, there was no ground state. You'd never reach it. But quantum mechanics said that you could attain the ground state. There was a possibility of going into a state which is essentially infinite. So this piece of metal, if you cool it down enough, and they have the right circumstances, it can flip into a state where all of the little electrons suddenly kind of line up with each other, and then something very remarkable happens. They stop being individual electrons, and it becomes one complete wholeness. Now, when I say one wholeness, that is the physics of it. What Bose realized was that it was no longer a bunch of particles interacting with each other. It was a single particle now. It was quite literally a single wholeness. You could not write down any physics to do with the individual particles anymore. This was his discovery, and Einstein thought it was so brilliant, he ensured it got published after the initial rejection that he got. So what's literally happening is that tiny little particle has expanded billions of times, literally become the wholeness. Now, if this doesn't, if you've studied anything of yoga or the Vedic science, this sounds very familiar, right? This principle, which is the root of our consciousness, theory of consciousness from a yogic point of view, is something that's a day-to-day phenomena in physics. It's just that it hasn't sort of filtered through. And that's because we've only been studying it in pieces of metal or some cold bit of gas, and we hadn't really looked into how it's actually working in the brain. So, I want to say a couple of words before I finish from the Jyotish point of view. So in the Jyotish point of view, what we see is that you look at the person's birth chart from the time of birth, say the ninth house. The ninth house shows your belief system that you get from your parents. And you can see this person will follow it, and this person will reject it. It's obvious on some level in the chart. You know, some people have very fixed ideas. Some people are quite flexible. Thank you. I've met people who are very vehement about their beliefs. In Jyotish, we say if the Brihaspati, the planet Jupiter, is afflicted, then religious wars can break out. If Ketu is playing, then people become completely headless. You know, we meet people who are completely headless. And if it's associated with the area of faith, then they become the fanatics. So what we realize is that, and this is in the birth chart, which means it's not being dictated by the planets. The person was born at that time, this is the theory, the person was born at that time because it somehow suited the destined mentality that the person came to bring with them. So looking at this, we see that all these different tendencies are natural. They just are, they just arise. And so this is why the Sanatana Dharma is the most tolerant of all the worldviews. Yeah, because they had the wisdom that the rishis gave, and the wisdom showed them that it's all natural. So we should tolerate. We should try to accommodate, as long as it doesn't disturb the peace. And this is the greatness of India, I would say. So, I could talk more, but I'll talk more tomorrow. But anyway, so the scientists also observed, you see, you might look at Jyotish, as I do on an almost daily basis, and think, it's so bizarre that it works so well. Why does it work so well? Why are people just like that chart? Like, why? Why not try and do something different today? Of course, you can see in the chart if someone will change as well. That's also there. But this is also something the physicists noticed. Now, why is it the small human mind can understand the vast universe? Why it just seems so irrational? And this is something that the great physicists have commented on. So there is something that connects us with the wholeness. And possibly, and I think probably, over the next few decades, this will be something which comes more and more in the forefront of intellectual understanding. And I think today's conference is a very good flag bearer for this modern trend. Thank you.